G'day, it's Mark and welcome back to the channel. In this new series, we are going to cover every model of the Ford Fairlane. And so this episode begins with the groundbreaking ZA. The concept for the ZA Fairlane was developed by Ford Australia product planner, David Ford. He figured that by amalgamating the rear quarter panels and some of the sheet metal from the American Ford Fairlane with the Australian XR Falcon, he could create a new luxury model in the market. The Fairlane name was familiar to Australians as it had been offered since 1959 with the opening of the Ford Broadmeadows factory, where the tank Fairlane in sedan and ranch wagon form were offered. Subsequent to that, there were a number of American Ford Fairlanes that were assembled in Australia prior to the release of the ZA Fairlane. Amongst these smaller American Fairlanes was the FB from 1962, the FC from 1963, the FD from 1964. And these were offered with a range of engines. The earlier ones, the 221 cubic inch 3.6 litre V8 was fitted to the 1962 model. And then in 1963, there was a 260 cubic inch 4.3 litre V8. And then in the 1964 model, there was a 260 V8 or an optional 289 V8. And they were both great engines, and these smaller compact Fairlanes were terrific little cars. Probably a little small, though, for that luxury segment that they were entered into, but they still did carve out, a popular following and cemented the Fairlane name in Australia. The compact Fairlanes were produced at Ford's Homebush plant, and upon release in 1962, it was around $200 cheaper than the previous tank Fairlane models that were its predecessor. And there were 1,632 of those examples produced. And then at the FC model for 1963, that production totaled 1,771 units. And then the FD, which is a 64 model, which lost the fins at the back, sold 1,344. The ZA Fairlane was introduced in March 1967 and was designed and built in Australia. And as I said, conceived by Ford Australia product planner David Ford, no relation to Henry Ford. It was based on the XR Falcon, which in itself was a landmark car that redefined the Australian market. And equally, the Ford Fairlane also redefined the Australian market in the luxury segment and was soon to become the market leader. The ZA Fairlane was offered as a Ford Fairlane or a Ford Fairlane 500. And it was based off the Falcon's 2,819mm wheelbase, which was stretched to 2,946mm. The front and rear body sections were retained, and the car had a unique front grille with quad headlights, so it really had a very good level of differentiation from the standard Falcon and Fairmont models. While at the rear it used rear quarter panels and boot lid from the US Ford Fairlane with square tail lights with a rectangular centerpiece. And again, this looked very different to the round tail lights that were used on the Falcon. Fairlane was equipped with a standard 200 cubic inch 3.3 litre six-cylinder engine with the option of a 289 4.74 litre V8. The Fairlane 500 featured the 289 V8 as standard equipment. The six-cylinder engine was available with a manual or automatic transmission, while the V8 was only available with an automatic. Before long, if you were a real estate agent, a mid to high level manager, if you owned your own business, you'd soon be seen driving around in a Ford Fairlane. It certainly redefined the luxury car market in Australia and became the market leader. It was a very successful vehicle. A couple of really nice touches in the interior dash, but also on the bonnet or hood emblem was the use of the Southern Cross, which is a series of stars that can be seen in the Australian sky, which held quite a bit of, I suppose, nostalgia and identified with Australian culture. If you look at the Australian flag, you can also see the Southern Cross represented there, and that was a nice touch to, I guess, Australianise a vehicle that had quite American styling themes. Inside, there was a nice use of, albeit fake, but wood grain treatment on the dashboard and also on the door trims. And one thing I really liked about these early Fords were the beautiful, very plump, comfortable bucket seats that they had in the Fairlane 500, whereas the standard Fairlane had the bench seat. So you can tell the ZA Fairlane just at a sort of a quick glance by the rectangular tail lights. These were updated later on in the ZB model, which we'll cover off in a future episode. And you can also see the little V8 badge that was on the lower front mudguard of the car on the V8 models there. Obviously, the 6 didn't have that. Some of the options available were a vinyl roof, radial ply and white wall tyres, a laminated graduated tinted windscreen, push-button radio. In the custom, you could also option for the Mustang 289 V8. That's how it was branded, very much like Mustang bred Falcon. That was used as quite a strong theme in the marketing by Ford Australia. The Cruiser-matic automatic transmission was available as an option on the base Fairlane. It was standard on the 500. Power front disc brakes were shown as an option. They were standard on the Fairlane 500. Power steering was also an option on the Fairlane, again standard on the Fairlane 500. The radial ply and white wall tyres, an option on the base Fairlane, as well as the Fairlane 500, which I mentioned earlier. Full wheel covers and the vinyl roof were also available as options on the standard Fairlane, as was the laminated graduated tinted windscreen, the push-button radio, and also an electric clock. The electric clock was standard on the Fairlane 500. Overall dimensions, I'll give these in inches. The overall length of the car was 196.1 inches long. The width was 74.7 inches. The height was 55 inches. And the wheelbase, which I mentioned earlier, that was 116 inches. Fuel capacity was 16.4 gallons. The car weighed in at around 3,215 pounds for the Fairlane 500 and 2,985 pounds for the Fairlane. Obviously, that only had the 6-cylinder as standard. When looking at the interior, the cars were nicely equipped with, the clock, push-button radio, the power steering, the Cruiser-matic transmission in the Fairlane 500. Those other options were in the Fairlane 500, although standard, but they were available as an option in the base Fairlane. But the dashboard, the instrument panel, had very much a look from the Lincoln Continentals in terms of the way the instruments were laid out. They may have even used some of the parts bin pieces from US cars. Wouldn't surprise me at all, actually. And I guess just like the XR Falcon, which again redefined the Australian car market, the Fairlane did the same, and they were very ruggedly built cars. They had great luggage capacity in the rear, very roomy inside. But, while it was a car that was favoured by, managers and business owners, corporate leaders and so on, it was also a car that farmers used. They could, if they, a wealthy farmer, he could take that car to town to get supplies and so on, but he could still drive it on the dirt roads that were pretty common in rural Australia back in the day, probably still are today to some degree. But the car could handle those tough conditions, and it got a good reputation for that. One thing I should mention, I may do a series on these as well, was to coincide with the launch of this car, you could still buy the Ford Galaxy, the full-size American Galaxy. That had been available since 1964. So for this model here, the 67 Galaxy was available. So if you're sort of a mega wealthy business person or farmer, you could sort of step up from the Fairlane to the Galaxy. But certainly the Fairlane was the volume seller in the luxury car market. It was the top-selling car, as I mentioned before, in that luxury segment. As I mentioned, one of the features I really like about these cars, and also if you looked at a Fairmont or something like that, were the individually reclining front seats with a center armrest, and they were supremely comfortable cars. They looked really good as well, but just very nice, thick foam and terrific looking interior. In the rear, there was also a fold-down armrest for passengers at the back. So, accommodations in the car and comfort in the car was very well done. The marketing of the Fairlane 500 described the car as one of the finest performing cars in Australia. The standard 200 horsepower Mustang 289 V8 gives you instant acceleration and effortless high-speed cruising. Your transmission is a world-famous Cruiser-matic drive. You are therefore provided with the undisputed power linked to the smoothest of all automatic transmissions. In addition to front power disc brakes, your Fairlane 500 is equipped with power steering. No matter what type of road you travel, you will find the Fairlane immensely satisfying and easy to drive. The reason is Fairlane's long wheelbase, 116 inches, and wide track, 58 inches, which gives you exceptional stability under all conditions. Big, wide tread, low-profile tyres provide a quieter, road-gripping ride. Ford's unique torque box chassis construction also plays a major role in the secret of Fairlane 500's unsurpassed road-holding abilities and quietness of ride. That's an extract from the brochure. Some of the retail advertising and magazines and so on also talked about, the sort of successful business person. One of them goes on to say, it may be that you like to fly your own plane, or that you're a man used to making decisions and wise investments, that you enjoy today's good life and live it with zest. It certainly says that your choice of luxury motor car is an astute one. For Fairlane's sleek styling and power are commanding. Its list of luxury items is so impressive there is no need for options, even though there were some. In size, it is ideally suited for today's driving conditions. If you have yet to discover the new Fairlane, do so now. Let Ford Fairlane say there's something special about you. There you go. And it was Fairlane by Ford rather than Ford Fairlane. And yet another promotion said, the rustle of silk, the sparkle of diamonds, the excitement of a special occasion. And the car, Fairlane by Ford, a very special motor car that moves in expensive circles and is bought by people who are accustomed to the best that money can buy. Yet the Fairlane is far from being expensive, even though it's available with all the extras you could wish for in a fine car. And it goes on to talk about some of the features. So they were positioning the car as a high-end luxury car that pretty well gave you everything, but also a great value car. And I think that's very true, and that's why the car was so successful. It's also worth mentioning that there were a number of Fairlanes modified. This was kind of a common thing that happened in Australia, whether it was on Galaxies or Studebakers or a whole range of cars, but larger V8-based cars were often converted for ambulance duties. And here's an example here of a ZA Fairlane that was converted, and that would have been quite a common sight back in the day, with these cars being used for ambulance duties. along with, the Galaxy's Studebakers and other vehicles that I mentioned. So the ZA Fairlane was produced from March 1967 to March 1968, before being replaced by the ZB Fairlane. Total production of the ZA Fairlane was 8,814 vehicles. So a very, very popular car in its first launch year of sales, on the market for 1 year, and did very well, particularly compared to the imported compact Fairlanes, which, as I mentioned earlier, had sold 1,300 examples for 64, for example, and 1,700 for 63, and I think 1,632 for 62. So substantially greater volume and more profit, because the cars were built predominantly, parts from Australia. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode on the ZA Fairlane. Keep an eye out for upcoming episodes. The next one will be the ZB, and then we'll cover the full series of Fairlanes until the final vehicle in BF. So make sure you stay tuned, and also check out the other history episodes in the series on the Falcon, which has already been completed, and there'll also be upcoming series on Holden Commodore and Chrysler Valiant. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time. Bye.